when I was asked to speak about rights and protection, and I'm very pleased to do so, in a sense I want to abuse the position and use you to help me through a quandary that I've managed to tie myself up in knots about over the last few months. In attempting to improve the relevance and quality of our humanitarian work by centering the rights of people affected by conflicts and disaster, we've inadvertently created two schools of thought that should fit hand in glove, but instead seem as if the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And what UNICEF is trying to do actively is trying to broker the relationship between, on the one hand, the human rights-based approach to programming, to bridge that with specific concerns around its role and responsibilities and specific niche in terms of the protection of children and women in crises. So let's begin with protection and the lovely diagram, a simple egg, but pretty deceptive really in its simplicity, because the egg introduces three spheres of action: responsive, remedial, and environment building. Looking at the white circle in the middle, where there's active abuse or risk of abuse, those responsive actions are the urgent actions to stop or prevent violations. Then with time and as the situation improves and as opportunities emerge, remedial actions may become possible, and they're to do with restoring people's dignity. And more broadly and longer term, the Protection Aid talks about environment building strategies. And that's huge. I mean, the definition talks about building political, social, cultural, institutional, economic, and legal processes and changes that all build towards a society that basically will not tolerate abuse of people's rights. So a simple shape, but the content of the egg is, in my mind, quite profound. People often refer to the egg as all-encompassing, but it's not intended to be. It's not intended to cover everything we do on the ground in humanitarian response. And the Interagency Standing Committee argues that it cannot be assumed that humanitarian programs always consciously aim to prevent or stop violations of international humanitarian, human rights, or refugee law, or to seek to assist people in achieving those rights. Programs may not be strategically designed to enhance the protection of civilians. And hence we end up with co-location of protection with assistance. Protection is intended to complement humanitarian assistance, where assistance is not explicitly concerned with preventing or halting human rights violations. Two sides of the same coin, so we're told. So while all this was happening on the protection side with ICRC and later with the Interagency Standing Committee through the 90s, at the same time the UN was going through its own confabulations around UN reform and debates about the role of the United Nations system and rethinking through the relevance of the Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So what? What does all this mean in terms of the UN in the 21st century? Well, there was substantive progress, and it's referred to as the Common Understanding, and it's largely a UN resource. What does it mean for us? And the Common Understanding basically highlights that all programs, and it is very much caged in terms of development cooperation, granted, but it does say all programs should further the realization of rights in all sectors and in all phases, hence the understanding that it does and should lead to a realization in humanitarian response. And that programs should actively seek to build the capacity of both rights holders to claim their rights and of duty bearers to fulfill their obligations. That, in essence, is the common understanding. So there are clear overlaps with protection. Both refer to all rights, both take a long-term view. But there are also several distinctions. Protection includes international humanitarian law alongside human rights and refugee law, whereas rights-based programming in terms of the common understanding refers to human rights instruments only. So there is an immediate difference in implied reach in terms of the human rights architecture between these two definitions. But does it really matter whether and how these two concepts overlap? I think it does matter, and I think we really do need to have further clarity around this. And there are two reasons why I think we need clarity about protection and human rights-based programming. Firstly, I think confusion is beginning to influence some of the processes we work through as humanitarians. And one mechanism is the ISC clusters, including the protection cluster. My concern is that this cluster seems to have become the default human rights cluster. And I think this risks protection losing the specific focus on special measures required to halt or prevent patterns of abuse. And it also risks human rights becoming boxed under the workings of only one cluster, protection, whereas it should be integral to the workings of all the others, 9 of them: health, water, nutrition. So if you think about the coin, which talks about protection and assistance, protection is saying that it's protection of all rights, assistance not, if it's not explicitly aimed at realizing rights. And at the same time, human rights-based programming is saying that that should influence both, and it's all-encompassing because it's to do with all rights. But protection is already all rights. So are we talking about one and the same thing? Is protection human rights-based programming, but in a different sort of context? Are they different spheres? Are we talking about a new egg? I don't know. Is this in any way resonating with any of your experiences and dilemmas on the ground? Would NGOs gain confidence and clarity of role with a clearer demarcation between protection and rights-based programming? Might defining protection and the associated skill set only in terms of the remedial actions referred to in the egg help increase the speed and quality of protection response, which was found lacking in Darfur, for example, early on? So what do you think? Is this something that would actually help operations and strategic priorities, or is this more blah blah?